Welcome to my O-scale three-rail layout, CONUS lines. CONUS being the Navy's acronym for Continental United States. It's particularly appropriate for my approach to the hobby because I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which had 7 Class 1 railroads, and was stationed in the Navy on the East Coast in 3 ports from Rhode Island to Florida, and on the West Coast from Washington State to San Diego, California. I modeled different regions and different time frames, changing everything about once every 6 months. What we're running today and what this video will cover is the Nickel Plate Railroad from the time period 1948 to 1965. The train you just saw go by is in the town of Armstrong, the highest point on the main line, Armstrong being named after my personal friend and a longtime dean of O-scale layout planning, John Armstrong. The train that you see going through the town right now is powered by 2 demonstrator F units that General Motors loaned to the Nickel Plate, painted in their paint scheme in the late 1940s, hoping that they would buy F units. NKP never did because they had this admirable fleet of Berkshires, and when they finally dieselized, they dieselized with Alco switchers and General Motors general purpose locomotives. Northern Nickel Plate never had any F units. But you can see the rolling stock here reflects this time frame, and a typical, in this case, westbound train on Nickel Plate, largely comprised of trailer on flat cars handed over to the Nickel Plate in Buffalo from the Lackawanna Railroad. The layout itself is in a basement 28 feet wide and 34 feet long. As you see, the Nickel Plate Berkshire here, eastbound, broken up grade, a 2.1% grade towards Armstrong. You see the 2 levels of the layout here, the main line, which is double track, and the branch line above, which take the railroad from the yard of down at the base level of 46 up to a height of 60 inches over the layout. In terms of specifics of the layout, it's largely comprised of Atlas track, and with most turnouts being powered through just the hand throw, only those turnouts that are out of easy reach are powered by remote switch machines. I like to follow trains around. Here you see a westbound passing an eastbound. The eastbound was largely a meat train from the packing centers in the Chicago and St. Louis area. The westbound is carrying largely material coming from the east coast of the United States to Chicago and St. Louis. The layout is basically a plan developed by John Armstrong back in the 1970s from a book which had its plan in it called Big Trains You Can Have Fun With. It was given to me by a fellow O-scale modeler, and it fit perfectly in my basement. My wife, who along with my 2 daughters were big parts in my model railroad experience, suggested a few changes to allow more room for buildings and scenery, but the layout that I have, CONUS lines today, is largely an 80% John Armstrong layout. It features a double-track main line and numerous areas that allow extensive modeling. You see here the town of Cumberland, with a station largely resembling that of the Western Railroad in Cumberland. And in this case, both trains are meeting in Cumberland, the westbound F-powered unit, F-unit powered freight, and the eastbound meat train, powered by an S3 class Berkshire. Armstrong's layout had a double-track main line, which I have always been in favor of because continuous running allows me to exhibit my trains, and a lot of folks that come to see the layout, they like to see trains run. And particularly since my motive power is largely Mike's train house with sound and smoke, as you have seen and heard, a double track layout really allows the viewer to catch the special nature of O-scale railroading. It's big. It's three times, two times in each dimension, length, width, and height. And when you see an HO railroad and then you see an O-scale layout, the difference is readily apparent. And then all MTH engines have both sound system and smoke. It further improves and enhances the real nature of O-scale model railroading. It's interesting that a lot of my equipment, although it runs on three-rail track, in this case Atlas track, can run on O-scale, two-rail O-scale layouts. I run O-scale trucks with no problem at all on the freight cars, and I use on all my freight cars Kadee couplers. I do not use the lLnes claw. I like the realism of the Kadee coupler, the close distance between the cars, and the overall appearance. It is a challenge to sometimes put Kadee couplers on certain pieces of rolling stock, but over the years with basswood and plastic and a lot of different type couplers manufactured by Kadee, I have been able to basically replicate in O-scale what you see on two-rail scale layouts and what I enjoyed for many years in HO. Here you see a westbound coming through Cumberland behind an S3 class Berkshire. And if you take a look at the rolling stock, you will see that there is Atlas, there is lLnes, there is MTH, and there is Weaver, all on these trains. I have a large collection of rolling stock dating from basically the mid-1980s onward. And I've kept everything so that I have a large selection of rolling stock to match the period and the region that I am modeling. The cars that you just see going past are cars that I got at the O-scale National Convention that was held here in the Washington, D.C. area back in 2018. It's always interesting when people come to see the layout, they see things and they wonder, how did you do this? A common question to all of us in model railroading. Here you see a train approaching the mountain flag stop of McClellan. McClellan, of course, being named for Alan McClellan, a very famous HO scale modeler. In Dayton, Ohio, I saw his Virginia and Ohio layout at the 1965 National Model Railroad Association Convention. I have named all the towns on my layout for model railroaders that meant so much to me when I was growing up and contributed so much to my understanding of the hobby. Again here, the grade is about 2.1%, and the sound gives you an idea of the challenge of the grades, in this case, to the S3 class Berkshire. I chose to stay with three rail as my daughters got older and of course went on to college and having lives of their own, basically because it had always been a family hobby. My wife was very much into it, painting figures, building structures, and I had already invested so much time and effort in three rail scale that I elected to stay with it as opposed to converting to two rail scale. And basically the MTH locomotives, I mean, look at these Berkshires. I mean, they are beautiful locomotives. They're all scale. The drive wheels obviously have the deeper flange for three-rail track. Every car that you see here, from Atlas and Intermountain to lLnes to MTH, is a scale car. Most of them have scale trucks. All of them have Kadee couplers. Some are heavily weathered, some are relatively lightly weathered, but I do weather all of my rolling stock. Again, the common attributes of a two-rail scale layout and what I did when I was an HO modeler for many years. I like this particular location because of the nature of the operation condensed between two tunnels, and it's really impressive when you have 2 and sometimes 3 trains climbing the grade here, exiting the tunnel, in this case the eastbound nickel plate passenger train running from St. Louis to Cleveland. And you see that the grades affect the sounds of the locomotives, and particularly like smoke coming out of the steam engine. It's a great feeling. The three-rail approach to the hobby, it has allowed me to enjoy many of the great things that I like about model railroading. The sound, the action, it just all contributes to the overall scene. Now you're in Ellison, again, named for that famous O-scale modeler, Frank Ellison. This is Ellison Yard. This is the largest yard on the layout. It's actually about 18 feet long. You'll see, of course, you'll recognize some of the structures, the flats weathered from various commercially available equipment, the oil tanks there on the left, heavily weathered. And you'll see here the nickel plate passenger trains. I've changed motive power. The two PAs are gone, and now we have a single GP9 powering the train. The GP9, of course, with the overhead air tanks, was used in passenger service in the later years of nickel plate passenger service. You see here in the foreground a couple of tanks being offloaded, one tank being offloaded, as well as a truck. These are all destined for a World War II museum that is opening up. I do this a lot. I have a lot of 1/48 scale armored vehicles. I have one train from the World War II era. I have another train from the Vietnam War era, and a final train from the Desert Storm era that I use when I'm running particular time frames. I always like to have some sort of military component on the layout, either in the yard or being offloaded on a dock or in the train itself. In this case, the tank is being offloaded onto a platform to be transferred to a museum. It's interesting when people come, particularly two-rail O-scale modelers, they very quickly eliminate or forget about that middle rail, that third rail. And since the trains are the same size as the ones in their own layouts or in fellow O-scale modelers' layout, it's very easy to, because of the Kadee couplers, because of the scaled trucks, because of the weathering of the rolling stock, it's very easy to forget you're looking at a three-rail layout and go back to basically a two-rail layout like so many of them operate and have in their homes and have visited. It's always interesting when you look at things like this to take a look around to see the context of the location. I'm big into context. The movie billboards on the layout, in this case at Ellison, all reflect that 48 to 55 time frame. I change all of the automobiles, the vehicles, to match the era being modeled. So I have a fairly significant inventory of various road cars, trucks, etc. The figures, and there are over 700 figures hand-painted on the layout. My late wife painted a large number of them. And they also kind of reflect a general area. I try to model a series of vignettes. In this case, there are 27 vignettes on this layout, which basically capture an individual interest or a particular scene. I like to have figures talking to one another. I like to have interaction between the figures. It's clear what they are doing and why they are doing what they are doing. In the towns, particularly in Armstrong, there are more than a dozen figures all interacting one with another. And it's fascinating, as many of you who are model railroaders have experienced, when visitors come to the layout, and there are about 2 or 3 open houses a year on CONUS lines, the trains are interesting. But what really captures the interest of the people that are not model railroaders is the scenery, is the people. They like to see what is happening, and without you explaining it, they understand the scene that is being depicted. So, for example, in this case, we're at the eastern end of the yard in Ellison. And there's lots of things going on here. Trains going, there's a yard behind it, there's a switcher back there, flat switching cars. Just in the foreground, uh, there is a work going on in undercutting the railroad because there's been a washout because of a heavy rainstorm. People like to concentrate on that. When they come to see the layout, they're always talking about the figures and the individual scenes, and the trains, as Frank Ellison famously said, are kind of like players. They come in, on the left stage, exit right stage, they cross in front, but they just set the overall scene for the location and what is actually happening, where you don't have to explain in great detail. For example, those nickel plate demonstrator units you see passing here in the foreground. Yes, it was General Motors trying to sell the nickel plate on F units in the late 40s, but to the average person, that doesn't mean a whole lot. They're asking themselves, oh, look at the cars. What's Phoebe Snow? A very common question, because most of them are not aware of the famous Lackawanna passenger train. But then when the O-scale modeler comes, the individual that knows the nickel plate, he'll look at those demonstrator units and say, you got the demonstrator units, because those are not very common. It was a special run done by a hobby shop in northern Ohio, and I was fortunate to be able to purchase a set. Now, in this case, we're at Georges Creek Junction. If any of you are Western Maryland and Baltimore and Ohio modelers, you recognize the name Georges Creek Junction. It's the west end of the Narrows, coming through the mountains just west of Cumberland, Maryland. My family spent a large number of days in quality time, particularly in the fall, at Georges Creek Junction, photographing on the Baltimore and Ohio, then Chessie system, and eventually CSX, and the Western Maryland Scenic Railway. So I reproduced here the track arrangement at Georges Creek Junction, and it always, when the family would come down, they'd look at that, they'd see the name on the sign on the layout and say, I remember that, Dad. To me, that was a great thing about children growing up with model trains, which is why I stuck with O-scale. And so very much with daughters now in their 30s, they still recall the road trips. When they come and when they bring their children to see the layout, they are always eager to tell stories about what they did with their mom and dad as a family at these particular locations that are modeled on the layout. Again, to me, that family element of model railroading was paramount in importance, something that I really, really strove to achieve over the almost 30 years that this layout has been up. Again, Berkshire locomotives. Both of my daughters have actually seen the nickel plate work run by the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. And so when they see the locomotive, when they see the J, if I'm running Norfolk and Western, when they see 4501, if I'm running Southern, they say, Dad, I remember that locomotive. That's the great thing to be about model railroading. Yeah, all of us haven't seen the daylight, although I have many times, and I have 4 different kinds of daylights on here. But the fact that my children have seen the Berkshire, have seen the J, have seen 4501, have seen my pictures of Big Boy. I was at the Golden Spike Sesquicentennial in April of 19. That brings home the reality of railroading and model railroading to my family. Here you see the nickel plate train. Again, the St. Louis to Cleveland train going through. The PAs are back on board, changing out motive power periodically. Those Alco PAs are beautiful engines, and I was fortunate to be down in North Carolina when the nickel plate repainted PA was on display during the Streamliners on Parade celebration in 2013 or 2014. A great experience. It was great to see the nickel plate work. Now we're on the east end of Ellison Yard, a warehouse that duplicates many I have seen, in this case one in Vancouver, British Columbia. Again, you see in this case 779, the last locomotive built by Lima Locomotive Works, the last Berkshire for the Nickel Plate Railroad, bringing another freight through. Again, see the vehicles, they all reflect the era of the layout being run. If I was running 21st century, I'd probably have a high rail truck there. Again, it's a great part of the hobby that every 3 to 6 months you're changing everything out. A changeover in terms of motive power, rolling stock, passenger and freight, and billboards, vehicles, etc. It takes about a month and a half to do. It went a lot faster when my wife was with me. Sadly, she has passed away now, although many of the buildings that she built, some kit bash, some scratch built, as well as all the figures that she painted, are really a testimony, a legacy to how much my wife meant to my hobby over the 30 some odd years that we were married. Again, if you take a look at the rolling stock, you'll recognize some Lionel. Those Swift reefers are Lionel, followed by a Weaver reefer, followed by an Atlas reefer, and of course an MTH caboose at the end. The great thing about 3-rail scale layouts or 2-rail scale layouts today is there is so much equipment available that you can purchase and modify as you want to be as realistic as you want. Again, a lot of people don't, in the 3-rail area, don't use Kadee couplers. They use the Lionel knuckle couplers. But years ago, I went that way. I talked with the folks at York from the Gauge Railroading magazine, and they convinced me that, yeah, it was costly initially, sometimes frustrating, but you would really be satisfied with the final product. And I certainly have been on this layout. I mean, I've got, when the layout is up and the rolling stock is out, you'll generally have about, between the freight trains running and the yard and the mines and everything, you'll have about 60 some odd pieces of rolling stock on the layout. Okay, now we're beyond Ellison Yard. What you're looking at here is the broad curve approaching mid-grade, which is on the 2.4% climb out of Allen up towards Armstrong, mid-grade being, of course, the tower halfway between the two stations. The farmhouse that you see above is a farmhouse that dates from the time when my children were very young, and they always had it on the layout. They had their own rooms, they had their own little figures. Again, that's part of the family nature of this hobby. Here you see mid-grade. You see the train going by, and acknowledging the workmen as well as the rail fans that are taking pictures. This is one of those areas, one of those great scenic curves, very common in John Armstrong layouts. Has the broadest radius curves, and you can see a 15 to 18 car freight train, a 7 to 9 car passenger train strung out on this curve. It's one of my favorite locations in the layout. Again, you got to appreciate the true genius of John Armstrong in designing these layouts. I could never, and Lord knows I've tried several times, to design layouts on my own, but when I got this layout, I showed my wife, and Melly said, let's build that. You're out of the Navy now, you're retired, it doesn't have to be modular, it doesn't have to be portable anymore. Let's build this Armstrong layout. And we did. And we started in 2006, so that's 15 years or so ago. It has been up, and I cannot say enough good things about the John Armstrong track plan. It has really, really met every desire I have, from a double track main line for continuous running, for a point-to-point, taking yard coal from the yard over to the power plant, or for a out and back when a branch line engine works upgrade above the nickel plate Berkshire. You see up to the summit, which is 60 inches off of the basement floor, and has the big coal mine there that provides coal to the power plant way down on the ground level. Again, you look at these locomotives, you hear them, you see them. I mean, look at this. This is a scene that you could have seen in the highlight of the golden age of steam power on the nickel plate railroad. It's there. It's what made the nickel plate so great. It's what made those Berkshire locomotives so classic, and just how they met the needs of that railroad for so long. Again, uh, you've got to appreciate what Mike's Train House did for the O scale hobby, both two rail somewhat, and particularly in three rail. And I have benefited tremendously in the 30 some odd years that I have purchased Mike's Train House products. They gave me the variety, the accuracy, the action, the sound, everything that I could possibly have hoped for. Now we're further downgrade. We're moving from mid-grade down towards Allen. Allen being, of course, named for the famous HO modeler, John Allen from the Gory and Defeated, that I read so much about in the 1960s. Again, you see the train drifting downgrade. You'll also notice the branch line above the freight train, which will soon see a branch line train as it works upgrade toward the mine with some coal empties. It's fun when you do this to envision what things would have looked like back then. But for example, 6 months from now, I could be running 21st Century. I could be running Union Pacific. I have a big boy that I saw at the Golden Spike Sesquicentennial. I have painted and lettered the passenger cars that were on those specials in that time frame. I have double stack trains. I have Powder River coal trains filled with, the loads are filled with real Powder River coal that I got out of the Thunder Basin. It's a great hobby. Just about the time, okay, well, now let's see. I've been looking at the nickel plate for 4 or 5 months. Let's do something else. And, 2 months later, you're from northern Ohio and Indiana out to the plains of Wyoming, or you're in the Sierras on the Southern Pacific, or you're on a train to Florida. I have a lot of seaboard coastline, Atlantic coastline, and seaboard airline motive power, passenger, and freight cars. Again, it's a great hobby. I cannot be too pleased with how CONUS Lines has turned out for me. It's clearly the best train layout I have ever built. Great thanks to John Armstrong. I'm 70 years old. I just don't know that I'm going to build another train layout. I have so much fun in riding and running this, in engaging in special projects each time I change the region, and the motive power and rolling stock and everything. It's never a situation where you look at your layout and say, maybe I ought to build another layout. My approach to the hobby has given me everything I could possibly have asked for in terms of something to keep me occupied. And I'm telling you, as many of you know, with this terrible pandemic experience we've had for 14 months, if there was a hobby for the last 14 months, model railroading is it. Here you see that eastbound meat train. Now there's the local working upgrade towards the mine at Summit. As you can see, that's a 3% grade, but that RS3 will handle that relatively short train with no problems. It's been great having you here on CONUS Lines. I hope you guys got an idea out of what a different approach to O-scale model railroading can be as you experience multiple time frames, railroads, and rolling stock, all scale, but all capable of being run on 3 rail. It's a great hobby. To simply put it, as A.C. Collenbach said, I like trains.